Welcome back. This is Unit 6 on heredity, which is basically the discussion or study of how traits are passed from parents to offspring. First off, genetics is the study of heredity. So, the term heredity just means the passing of traits from parents to offspring. The sort of scientific study of that is known as genetics. And the sort of foundation for genetics all came from a body of work done by a monk called Gregor Mendel. And he was the first one, or one of the first people really, to ever experiment with heredity. And because of that, and because how strong his research was, he is often called the father of genetics. And there he is. Isn't he great? So, moving on, who exactly was Gregor Mendel? All right, first off, he was born in Heisendorf, Austria in 1822. He entered a monastery at the age of 21, mainly because his family did not have a lot of money. And because they didn't have a lot of money, and the only way that you could really study and be an academic is if you had money, and his family didn't have money, so his only option really was to enter a monastery because, funnily enough, monasteries, which are the places where monks study, and a monk is sort of a religious guy, monasteries were known for having these elaborate, huge libraries where all these books and all this knowledge was available, and monks were known for translating different books from different languages and creating new books and binding books. And so there was a whole bunch. He knew that there was a lot to be found in the monastery. So that was his choice, is to enter the monastery and then have access to all of this knowledge. The monastery sent him to Vienna, where he studied to become a teacher. Unfortunately for him, or maybe fortunately for us, taking tests was hard for him, and he sort of struggled with that process. I mean, he eventually did pass, but it made his pathway a little more limited. And so what happened is he ended up back at the monastery. And he did teach, but he also started doing garden research. And all of this garden research ultimately led to his principles of heredity that you'll learn about a little while later. Does anyone happen to know what his garden research plant of choice was? Well, it was the humble garden pea. All right. Why did Mendel choose garden peas? Well, he was already familiar with them from previous experiments. They grow really quickly, so he's able to actually get several generations in the same growing year. There are lots of different kinds that are available, and especially readily available to him. They are able to both self-pollinate, which means pollen from a flower on one plant can either fertilize that same flower or fertilize a flower on the same plant, a different flower on the same plant. And they can also cross-pollinate, which means pollen from one flower on one plant can fertilize the flower on a different plant. Okay, the fact that they could do both of those things was important to him. So it's not just one or the other, it's the fact that they could do both. What are some ways that pollination can occur? Okay, well, first off, we have to make sure we understand what pollination means. Pollination just means that the pollen from the male part of the plant is carried to the female part of the plant that contains the egg or the ovule. And so it's not fertilization per se, although fertilization usually happens as a result of it. It's just the movement of the pollen. And there's three basic ways that pollen can be transferred. They can be transferred by wind, by animals, or they can self-pollinate, which we just talked about in the slide before. All right, so which is which in this diagram here? If you look at the diagram on the left, this one over here, you'll notice that pollen is moving from one plant to another. So that process is known as, cross-pollination. And then the process that you see over here on the right This one over here, where the pollen is going from the same flower, from the male part on the one flower to the female part on the same flower, that is known as, you got it, self-pollination. Okay, so we're all good there. All right, so let's go through some more vocabulary. A characteristic is a feature that has different forms in a population. All right, a trait is a characteristic that an organism can pass on to its offspring. So you have genetic traits that you can pass from parents to babies. Things like attached earlobes that we talked about when we did the lab last week. Or free earlobes if you happen to be that way. And so, depending on what your parents are, you may be either a free earlober or an attached earlober. That sounds funny, doesn't it? All right. Historically, people have known a bit about how traits are passed on because people have been what's called selectively breeding things for thousands of years, okay? All the different dogs that we have today came about due to selective breeding, where breeders would choose for a particular trait, find the parents that had that particular trait, make sure that only those parents that had the trait that they wanted were able to breed, and then going through that selection process again with the babies. So whichever babies had the characteristic they want, they would choose those to breed for the next generation, and so on and so forth until they got the desired traits all together in one dog that they wanted. And that's how we ended up with so many breeds of dogs, because all dogs are the same species. I mean, all of them can interbreed, but the fact that they're also different is purely due to people selecting for certain characteristics that they wanted the dogs to have. All right, so people have known a little bit about heredity for a long time, but there were some misconceptions. A lot of breeders, and this is not just with dog breeders, a lot of people in general just believe that when you inherited traits, you always got a blend equally of what the mother looks like and what the father looks like. Okay, it would always be perfectly sort of mismatched, blended together. And the heredity that results from that is just whatever you got from your parents. Now we know today though that the heredity is just really not that simple. There's a lot more going on, and this is largely due to Mendel and his experiments. So what did Mendel study? Mendel studied 7 characteristics in peas. These 7, all right? He studied the shape of the seed. He studied the color. This is the shape of the seed, the color of the seed, the color of the flower, the shape of the pod, the color of the pod, the location of the flower, whether it was on the ends or on the sides, and the height of the plant. Those are all the different characteristic traits that Mendel looked at. What he noticed though, and what you may have noticed when I was going through that all, is that for each of these traits, there are 2 possible forms that the plant could have, or the seed or the flower, okay? So he noticed that peas had 2 forms for each of these traits. And so now he's going to set up his experiment. First off, he was careful to start out with what he called true breeding parent plants. And you were like, what's a true breeder? Well, okay, what's a true breeder? He found true breeders by self-pollinating, and then there's true breeders, and then checking their babies. If their babies had the same exact traits as the parents, then he knew the parents were true breeders. So basically a true breeder for Mendel was a plant that, if he allowed it to self-pollinate, would produce babies that looked exactly like the parent for whatever trait he was looking at. So for example, a true breeding purple flowering plant, if allowed to self-pollinate, will always produce plants that have purple flowers. That's the definition of a true breeding plant. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Purple flower. All right. Next, he isolated true breeders that had different forms of the same characteristics. So if he was looking at the height of a plant, he would try and find a true breeder that was a tall true breeder and a true breeder that was a short true breeder. Okay, so different forms of the same characteristic. He then removed the anthers, which are the pollen-producing structures on a flower, and or the stamens, depending which is where the female part of the flower is. Oh, sorry, hold on, let me rephrase that. The anthers, which are the pollen producers, or the stamens, which is the whole entire structure that has the anther attached to it, from the plants he wanted to fertilize. And he did this because he didn't want the plants to self-pollinate. He wanted to control exactly which plants were pollinating each other and exactly how the fertilization was going to occur. All right? So he'd use scissors or little tweezers or something, and he'd just snip off those parts so that there wouldn't be any pollen available to self-pollinate. He then took 2 true breeding plants that each exhibited a different trait of the same characteristic and crossed them together. Okay. For example, one plant that was a true breeding purple flowering plant and one plant that was a true breeding white flowering plant, he crossed them together. So the characteristic was flower color, and he got a true breeding purple and a true breeding white, and he cut the anthers and stuff so that he could control how the pollination was going to occur. And then he actually used a little paintbrush, and I'll show you that in the next picture, so he could transfer the pollen from one to the other, and he controlled who pollinated who. Okay, this initial pair of true breeders he called the parental generation, or the P1 generation. So here you see him, taking these 2 true breeders, cutting out the anthers on this one so it didn't self-pollinate, taking some pollen from this purple true breeder and transferring it over to the white true breeder. Okay, so, and that was it. That was the initial cross. So as a result of this pollination, the little flower, was fertilized and it made peas. Okay, that's what they do. And peas are seeds. And so he let those seeds mature from that plant, and he planted those seeds to see what kind of a plant would grow from them. And what he discovered, which is what you see here, is that all of the flowers on these first generation of plants had, if we're using the example that we were talking about with the flower color, all of them had purple flowers. They all had the same trait. So he was like, what on earth happened to the white, right? All right, so that first cross resulted in offspring that all exhibited the same trait, okay, which in that example was purple flowers. And he got similar results for all the other characteristics he tested, whether it was seed color or seed shape or whatever. Every time he crossed 2 true breeders together, that's P1 generation, he got a generation of plants that all had only one trait. So it seemed like one trait disappeared. Okay, so here are those. Every time he crossed purple and white flowers that were true breeders, he got purple flowers. Every time he crossed smooth and wrinkled seeds, he got all smooth seeds. Every time he crossed yellow and green seeds, he got all yellow seeds. Every time he crossed green pods and yellow pods, he always got green pods. Every time, if they were true breeders at the beginning. Mendel chose to call the trait that appeared in that first generation the dominant trait, and the trait that seemed to disappear the recessive trait, okay, because it sort of recedes into the background, all right, and the other one dominates. So here's an example of all the dominant traits he found, okay? So all of these ones down here, all of these ones down here at the bottom, these are what were the dominant traits, because they're the ones that appeared in the next generation. The trait here that disappeared, which are these guys right here, these are the ones that disappeared. Those he called recessive traits. Okay? All right. This first generation of plants that he produced that all had the same trait, he called that the F1 generation. F stands for filial or filius, okay? So, and that is a Latin word that refers to sons. So the F1 generation were the sons, okay, as opposed to the daughters. Sorry girls. He allowed this F1 generation, after all this was over, he allowed them to self-pollinate. All right, so he just let them fertilize themselves. And then again, he took all of those peas that resulted from that pollination fertilization, and he planted those new peas, and he grew a second generation, an F2 generation. And what he found in this F2 generation is that the recessive trait reappeared, okay? So this first generation of all purple flowers that came from the cross of the two true breeding parents, when they self-pollinated, they still produced a lot of purple flowers, but that white flower suddenly reappeared again. And so now Mendel was really confused. So what's going on? All right. He was careful. He repeated this experiment over and over again with each of his traits, and he always got the same result. All right. And he knew he was pollinating the way he needed to pollinate, and he knew he was repeating this experiment a number of times so that there was, he was eliminating any possible sources of error. So he knew that there had to be a set of instructions that were still being saved somewhere in those purple flowers for the white flower. Okay? Because every time only the dominant trait was seen in the first generation, and the recessive trait would reappear in the second generation. So somehow that the information for that recessive trait was still being stored in that F1, in this generation. Somehow that information for the recessive trait was still in there somewhere. So in order to try and get some more information, Mendel decided to count the number of times that each trait appeared in that second generation, just to see if sort of a numerical ratio would give him some additional information. All right? And a ratio, by definition, is a relationship between two different numbers that is often expressed as a fraction. All right? So here, if you had a set of numbers, like the number of purple to white flowers, and you can express that as a fraction, and you can reduce that down and eventually get near a whole number. That was sort of the process that Mendel did. All right? So here are his results, and Mendel did actually count all of these. All right? In his F2 generation, the one that came from the self-pollination of the F1, he got 705 purple flowers to 224 white flowers. He got 6,022 yellow seeds to 2,001 green seeds. He got 5,474 round to 1,850 wrinkled. You're getting the idea. But anyway, over here are all his results, his ratios. Somewhat reduced, but not completely. If you look at all of these, though, do you see sort of a common pattern, what all of these ratios are close to? Well, virtually all of the data was close to a 3-to-1 ratio, dominant to recessive. And it was at this point that Mendel sort of had his breakthrough moment, because he began to realize a scenario that would explain this ratio. Okay? First off, Mendel concluded that traits don't blend necessarily, because if they, there's never a 50-50 ratio between what the parent was to what the, offspring ends up being. All right? No blending, not necessarily. Okay? He did conclude that peas seem to prefer one trait over the other to a ratio of 3-to-1. He also concluded that traits in peas were determined by separate instructional units. All right? So there had to be 2 sets of instructions, one for each of the traits. And he realized that the only way that this would work is that if each plant had 2 sets of instructions for each characteristic, which is sort of what I just said, and that each parent would donate 1 set of instructions to the baby. Okay, so when you made a baby, one set of instructions would come from one parent and the other set of instructions would come from the other parent. It's called the law of segregation, but you don't need to know that. Not yet, anyway. He published his findings in 1865, and then nothing else ever happened. Because unfortunately, there was a lot of other stuff going on in the world, and nobody really recognized Mendel and gave him any credit until after he died. So sorry for Mendel, but he is, definitely very well recognized today as the great scientist that he was. All right. Today we call those inherited units of instructions genes. That's what we currently know them as. And we're going to talk more about that in the next section. But let me just quickly remind you that in genes we can have different forms of the same trait, and we call the different forms of the same trait alleles. Okay, so if you have a gene for flower color, you might have an allele for purple flower, or you might have an allele for white flower. Or if the trait is seed color, you might have an allele that represents the yellow seed color, and you might have an allele that represents the green seed color. Okay, so you can have different forms for the same trait, and those are called alleles. Mendel showed us that the dominant allele, like in our example, the purple flower, appears in peas more often and seems to hide the other form, the white flower, in our example. The recessive allele is the form of a gene that gets hidden, okay? And if both alleles for flower color get passed to the offspring, then the dominant allele that causes purple flowers will hide the recessive allele, okay? No white flowers will show up. So if we look at our true breeding cross again, all right, purple versus white, the dominant allele is the only allele that this purple flower can give. The recessive allele, because it's a true breeder, is the only allele that this flower can give. And when you combine the dominant and recessive allele, when you combine them in this baby, because the dominant allele is dominant, all of the babies will look purple. The dominant allele will hide the recessive allele.
Okay, so some more definitions here. We're going to talk about what a genotype is. An organism's genotype, which you can see down here, an organism's genotype shows the allele combinations of the gene it contains. And the way that Mendel chose to do this is he used letters, all right, to show the different forms of a gene. If it was a dominant trait, he chose to use a capital letter. If it was a recessive trait, he chose to use a lowercase of that same letter to represent that recessive trait. All right, so if he had a true breeding purple flower, he would represent the genotype with a capital P and a capital P. Because remember, he determined that there had to be 2 sets of instructions in every individual, and parents would only give 1 set of those instructions to the baby. All right, but you could also get a purple flower by having a genotype like this one of big P, little p. All right, because if you remember, if an individual has that capital dominant allele, that dominant allele will take over and express itself so that the recessive allele won't show up at all. All right, so in order to have a purple flower, you could either be big P or big P, little p. Okay, the only way that the white flower would show up is if you were little p. All right, because as soon as you get that big P in there, it turns the flower purple. All right, so the only way you'll see a white flower is if you have a homozygous recessive genotype, a little situation, little p in this case. All right, so if we look at some examples of genotypes, we have some over here. These are some of the traits that Mendel worked with here. All right, so for purple, since it was dominant, he gave it the capital P allele. For seed shape, because round was dominant, he gave it the capital R allele. For seed color, he gave it capital Y for yellow. And for pod color, he gave it capital G for green. And then all of the recessive traits have the same letter, just as a lowercase. So the recessive for the flower color was white, so it got a little p because purple was the dominant. Wrinkled got little r, green got little y, and yellow got little g for pod color. And then here are all the possible genotypes that could have resulted if you have 2 sets of instructions for every parent. And then how that translates physically into what we call a phenotype, because physical phenotype is what it looks like, okay, is this, all right? If you're capital P, you're purple. If you're capital P, you're still purple. If you're little p, you're white, okay?
An organism's phenotype is the form of a trait that is visible. It's what you actually see. All right, so for flower color, a pea plant can show a phenotype of purple or of white, okay? But from the page before this, we know that the genotype for this one, for like this purple flower, the genotype for it could either be big P, or big P, little p. Whereas the genotype for the white flower would have to be little p. Those are little, okay? Those are supposed to be little. Make sure. Little. All right. So an overview of what Mendel did using the different genotypes and phenotypes would be this, okay? His P1 parental generation of true breeders, these guys. The purple flowered parent, since it's a true breeder, would have 2 alleles that are the same for the dominant trait, capital P, capital P. Its phenotype would be purple. The true breeding white flower would have a genotype of little p, and a phenotype of white. When they were crossed in that first generation, to make the first generation, they produced a purple flower that had a genotype of big P, little p, because that's the only, if each parent only gives 1 set of instructions, the parent that was purple can only give a capital P, the parent that was white can only give a little p, and that results in a baby that is big P, little p. But phenotypically, looking at it physically, it's going to be purple because the purple is dominant, right? Then the big P, little p generation self-pollinates to produce the second generation, and here is where he got some genotypes that were big P, producing purple flowers, some genotypes that were big P, producing purple flowers, and some genotypes that were little p, and those made the white flowers. So suddenly the white flower reappeared. And that's basically what Mendel did. And I think I need to stop there because we've gone for quite a long time. Okay, bye.